Hello and welcome to the Bunginator. If you're new here, welcome. I usually do gaming content, but today I thought I'd do a bit of history. Today we're going to be talking about the Siege of the Alcazar. Please, enjoy. The Spanish Civil War is forgotten by many, and sadly, that's the truth. Fought from July 17th, 1936 to April 1st, 1939. It is incredibly overshadowed by World War II, and to an extent, I understand. Having the bloodiest conflict in human history take place only 6 months later would make almost any other war forgotten as well. But I remember it, and so do Spaniards. I've noticed a lack of content on this subject on YouTube, and in the internet in general. All you'll find are more broad videos covering the entire war in like 20 minutes, or just covering the impact it had, but I'd like to get into more detail. The Siege of the Alcazar is a fascinating engagement, but first we need context. So what's going on here? I'll be frank with you, this conflict is one of the most confusing in the last 100 years that I've read about. So many factions and different interests make it difficult to explain. The war was a culmination of decades of build-up. Several defeats and embarrassments internationally for Spain, such as the American-Spanish War and the Rif War, caused a lot of upheaval in Spain, and people became polarized, even though they didn't lose the Rif War, but they were losing it for a while. Again, there's too much to cover here, but essentially, it was left-wing against right-wing. Minor uprisings and political assassinations ran rampant through Spain. The current government was left-leaning, therefore left-leaning groups such as workers' unions had more power over the right, sort of. It's really confusing. It's a lot more complicated than that, but that's the gist of it. Things took a turn for the worse in early 1936 when the left-wing political party called the Popular Front won the election and was voted into office. They beat the right-wing party by only 100,000 votes. It was 4.5 million to 4.6 million. It was insane. This made the right feel like they'd been cheated, and so the military, mainly officers who had already despised the current government, began to plan a coup. Similar to World War I, where all that was needed was a spark, that spark came on July 13th, 1936, when monarchist leader José Calvo Sotelo was assassinated by a group of assault guard, who essentially were the political police set up by the Popular Front. They'd be sent out to deal with their political dirty work, kind of like the SA. Sotelo was one of the most prominent figures on the right at the time, and his death sparked outrage, especially as the government had a hand in it. And so, on July 17th, the uprising began. The country split into two factions I'll be constantly referring to today. That being the Nationalists, who were the rebels, was made up much of the military and right-wing factions, and the Republicans. No, not the ones you're thinking of. They were the current government along with the left-wing groups such as communists, Marxists, and anarchists, just to name a few. Uprisings sparked all across Spain. The most successful were in parts of the north, excluding Asturias and the Basque country, and the Spanish-controlled area of Morocco, where the Army of Africa was stationed. Several uprisings were put down, such as in Barcelona and Madrid, where left-wing support was the strongest. Several uprisings would find themselves besieged while they waited for the two nationalist armies in the south and the north to relieve them. And this is where our story begins. Toledo is only 72 kilometers from Madrid, and the nationalist leaders weren't expecting any uprising to occur there. But on July 18th, the second day of their uprising, Colonel José Moscardo, military governor of the province of Toledo, called for all of the civil guard in the province to concentrate in the city of Toledo. The government made several attempts to order weapons from the arms factories in the city, but Moscardo refused every time, and the government threatened to send a force to confront him. Now we come to the star of the show, the Alcazar itself. First used by the Romans in the 3rd century, it was upgraded by Charles I and his son in 1540. The leader of the conquistadors was met there by Charles in 1521, and by the time of the war, it was a military academy, but only around 6 of the young cadets were present at the time for the siege, due to them being on vacation. The defenders were mainly made up of civil guard, who essentially were a military-style police force. They were they policed the area, but they were built like a military force. And the phalanges, who were Spain's variation of fascism, along with 100 army officers. All in all, there were around 1,100 defenders in the Alcazar, 500 women and children, and 100 left-wing prisoners, which they had taken in the city before pulling back into the fortress. At 7 a.m. on July 21st, a cavalry captain of the academy read a proclamation declaring a state of war in the main plaza of Toledo. The force sent by Madrid set out on the same day to put down the uprising. They were all militia, as most of the Republican troops in this early stage of the war were. About 60% of the army had sided with the rebels, along with 50% of the civil guard and other factions. So you can imagine how the government felt when their army split in half, and they're like, holy shit, we need troops right now. So They only had some groups that were loyal. The assault guard, which had been set up by them, about 80% roughly, sided with them. So, and the carabineros, which were like a military-style like border guard, sided with them a lot. But they had to arm civilian union workers and activists. So extreme radical left-wing people, like communist, Marxists, anarchists, basically anyone who hated the right. They had already been causing uprisings and stuff for the last few decades. There was a lot of anarchy in Spain. These militias also put down all of the other uprisings that happened in places like Madrid and Barcelona, like we mentioned. There was a few barracks that were overrun, and there was also another siege at Oviedo, which I might talk about sometime. But yeah, these militias were what the government relied on to put down the uprising. But these civilian union workers and activists were equally radical in their ideas as some of the nationalist faction. Thus, roughly 8,000 of them made their way to the outskirts of Toledo on the 21st. Moscardo pulled most of the defenders into the Alcazar and had some set up in the outlying buildings surrounding the fortress, like the buildings just outside. He pulled his forces back just as the militia entered Toledo. 200 of the civil guard were located in the arms factory when the militia arrived, and they began negotiations. But during this, the civil guard loaded up the trucks they had with as much ammo as they could from the weapons factory and escaped and drove into the Alcazar. The siege lines were set, and a telephone line was set up between the besiegers and the besieged. The Republican atmosphere and attitude was quite relaxed on their lines. Some of the men, and women actually, there were a few, would come in the morning, take a few shots of the fortress, hang out, and then go home for the evening in Madrid and sleep. Get up, they'd all hop on a truck and head back the next day, and this repeated over and over again. It was some time before they even brought up cannons, 175mm cannons, to actually do damage to the walls of the fort. But even this damage was negligible, as it took several shots to even do significant damage to the fortress, and it would take months for them to actually almost demolish the entire fort. So one little interesting fact I found when doing my research was apparently twice a day there was a blind man who would tap and walk his way between the two lines, like where the two people were fighting, and there was a ceasefire. They're like, oh yeah, don't shoot him, he's a blind guy, just chill. And then twice a day, everyone would stop shooting. So that's what I thought that was pretty interesting. But it's still an interesting note. On the morning of July 23rd, lawyer and chief of the workers' militia, Candido Cabello, called the Alcazar and asked to speak to Colonel Moscardo about their surrender. He said that if they did not surrender within 10 minutes, Moscardo's 24-year-old son, Luis, would be executed. According to sources, which may have been biased and propagandized for the right wing, since, they won the war, they're going to paint the history written by the victor, right? Luis was put on the phone to speak to his father, who told him to die bravely. Many of the defenders made Luis into a martyr and were determined to fight for his sacrifice, believing that he was executed immediately after the call. Though in reality, he was shot a month later as a reprisal for an air raid. The siege soon exploded into an international and an internal press. The story of the defenders and of Luis was painted as a anti-atheist crusade by the right, as much of the right were religious. And the left also killed priests, so many priests, along with those in Toledo, and especially across Spain, had been kicked out or murdered by the left, although this press helped cover up the fact that 100 of the left-wing prisoners inside the Alcazar were never heard from again. The press also falsely propped up the young army cadets, calling them heroes and saying these young men fighting for their ideals, but there was only 6 of them in the fort, and the less glamorous civil guard were doing the bulk of the fighting. The Republican press was also covering it. Journalists and other popular figures came to see the Alcazar, and also ceremoniously got to fire shots at it, and with the cameras taking pictures of them. Oh, look at these guys shooting the fort. There's all these celebrities, right? I say that, but I'm not 100% certain that that's true. I've heard it. Don't take my word for it, though. But by the 14th, the Republicans believed that they had damaged the northern wall of the fortress enough to begin their attacks. Over 5 weeks, the militia attacked the House of Military Government. Again, I can't really point out where this is because the information on where exactly it is in the city relative to the fort is really hard to find. But this is what all my sources have talked about. Over the next 5 weeks, the militia attacked the House of Military Government, whatever that means. I don't know why I wrote that in the script. 11 times they attacked, and each time they were repulsed. On September 9th, an envoy was sent by the Republicans to discuss the surrender of the Alcazar. The man sent was at the time ranked Major Vicente Rojo Luch, who would later lead the Republican army in some of the largest battles of the war, such as Guadalajara and the Battle of the Ebro. On August 16th, miners, no, not those kind of miners, like cave miners, brought in from Asturias, which was one of the main like mining provinces of Spain, I guess you could say. They had a lot of blue-collar workers who mined shafts. Miners were brought in from Asturias to dig explosive mines. Okay, that sounds really confusing, but I mean like explosive mines, like bombs, under the northwest tower of the Alcazar. The first sign of relief for the defenders came back on August 22nd, when a trunk full of food was airdropped into the fortress along with a note telling them that the Army of Africa was on their way to save them. Now, during all this, the Army of Africa in Morocco had been transported by planes, sent by Germany, by the way, over the Strait of Gibraltar into southern Spain, and were fighting their way north. I guess I should explain what the Army of Africa is. They're made up of two parts, the Spanish Legion and the Regulares. I think I'm saying that right. The Legion was Spain's Foreign Legion, and despite the name, was made up mostly of Spaniards. They were tough and experienced from their fighting in Morocco decades earlier, and were elite soldiers. The other half, the Regulares, were the local Moroccans recruited to fight for Spain. Like the Legion, they were elite and bloodthirsty. They were usually tribesmen. They wore their fezzes and their traditional headdress along with their uniforms, and they were ruthless. They were extremely good troops. The Army of Africa would form the spearhead of the nationalist war effort for the whole war. During the siege, the Army of Africa made its way north like lightning, taking city and town after town. Okay, back to the Alcazar. On September 18th, the two mines dug under the fortress were detonated by President of the Popular Front, Francisco Caballero, with the cameras rolling, kind of like when someone opens a new store and they cut the thing with the giant scissors. It was a big propaganda thing where he was going to detonate it, and then there's really good footage of it. You might see it here. I might be able to find it of the Alcazar's walls blowing up. Although this somewhat backfired, as it was public knowledge that there were civilians in the fortress. The southwest tower collapsed, 2 defenders were killed, and 10 minutes after the explosion, the militia went forward. 4 attacks were launched, supported by a few armored cars and tanks, but all were repulsed by the defenders, who now, by this point, were somewhat running low on ammo, so they wouldn't shoot at any enemies unless an attack was present. Republicans responded by bombarding the Alcazar all night and into the next day. The few buildings around the Alcazar, still occupied by the defenders, were so badly damaged that they couldn't communicate via telephone wire to the fortress. So on the night of September 21st, all the buildings were abandoned and the defenders concentrated in the Alcazar. On the 23rd, the Republicans got as close as they would ever get to taking the Alcazar. They surprised the defenders with dynamite and grenades at close range and then stormed the fort through all the gaps and breaches in the walls. They made some progress, pushing the nationalists back into the courtyard of the fort, but reinforcements from other sections of the fort came, shot down at them from the balconies, and reinforced their position, and eventually, the exhausted attackers were forced to once again withdraw, leaving the Alcazar to the nationalists. But later that morning they returned, and they tried again, supported this time by another tank. Wave after wave of militia surged forward over the mountains of rubble. The defenders poured on fire, taking out man after man, but after 45 minutes of brutal fighting, the Republicans withdrew to the outlying buildings. And also by this point, the fortress was so badly damaged it was unrecognizable. It was basically just a mountain of rubble, and that was it, with a few pillars. By the 26th, the Army of Africa's lead column under Jose Varela reached Burgas, just 6 kilometers, or 4 miles, from Toledo. The Republicans saw the writing on the wall. But on the next morning, they tried one last time to take the fortress, which again, after heavy fighting, the exhausted and low on ammo defenders drove them off. A few hours later, the Army of Africa column reached the outskirts of the city, and the majority of the militia fled to the nearby city of Aranjuez. Also, real quick, I'll explain what a column is, just for those who don't know. Basically, because the whole army of Africa is marching up one, road. It's like they're all in a long formation, so it's called a column. So the first column was under Jose Vadera. Although most of the militia fled to Aranjuez, a small number stayed and fought. They were hopelessly outnumbered and outmatched by the veteran troops surrounding them, and it didn't take long for most of them to surrender. Colonel Moscardo, defender of the fortress, promised that those who surrendered would be spared, but Jose Vadera did not feel the same. Those who surrendered were massacred, as Toledo's streets flowed red. Many of those trapped by the Army of Africa took their own lives. 200 militiamen, wounded in the hospital of San Juan Batista, were killed in their beds by grenades and bayonets, and some reports say not even pregnant women were spared. But Valera made his way to the Alcazar, where he was greeted by a dust-covered Moscardo who was standing at attention. Moscardo said, "Nothing to report at the Alcazar." Nothing to report being the code word sent out to all the different factions for the uprising to start, which no one had even asked the colonel to join. He repeated the same thing to Francisco Franco when he arrived. It was Franco's idea to relieve the fortress in the first place, even though he probably could have taken Madrid. Thus ended the most dramatic siege in the Spanish Civil War. It would be an enormous morale boost for the nationalists, much because of their propaganda, but also how much attention the Republicans gave it. They made a show of it, and it blew up in their faces. It became a symbol for the nationalist cause. It was so famous, in fact, that in 1940, a movie about it was made in fascist Italy, winning an award, which I have been playing clips of along with actual footage in the background. All in all, I find this event fascinating. From the actual fighting to the political impact, although this siege was only the beginning, as the war would drag on for another 3 years, costing the lives of around 500,000 Spaniards. And this hard-fought siege, its streets, rubbles, bullet holes, would not be the last. Thank you.